Technical side. Chair, we can go.
Good evening, everyone. I now call to order the Monday, May 12th, 2025 meeting of the City of Sugar Land Planning and Zoning Commission. Good evening, folks. Good evening, commissioners and staff. We will start with public comment. Do we have anyone here for public comment?
No, Chair, we do not.
We will go to item 3, facts, findings, and recommendation. Consideration of and action on a recommendation for the proposed redevelopment concept plan for Lake Point Green to members of City Council. Hi, Ruth. You're going to give us a presentation?
Yes, sir.
All right, we'll hear that, and then we'll do questions, and then we'll move on to consideration and action.
Okay. Good afternoon, commissioners. Thank you so much for your time for making another trip to City Hall, because I know that's exactly what you wanted to do at 4 o'clock on a Monday. We are here to do a consideration and action on the Lake Point Green redevelopment concept plan. So just as a reminder, some background, the Lake Point redevelopment district was created and this property was rezoned to the new district in December of 2023. The zoning district sets the standards and processes for development in this area, and it also establishes the requirement for a redevelopment concept plan to take place prior to other development steps. The redevelopment concept plan is intended to provide a mechanism for reviewing large, complex, or phased projects in the Lake Point redevelopment district. It also enables the Commission and Council to evaluate the development's relationship with the surrounding area, the location of proposed uses, connectivity, and public spaces, and ensure that the applicant is demonstrating compliance with the housing mix requirement. The approval criteria that are established in the development code is that the concept plan should be consistent with the terms and conditions of any prior approvals that are not proposed to change, that it should be consistent with the comprehensive plan and any other applicable plans. It should be consistent with the purpose statements and applicable standards of the development code. And finally, it should consider the existing roadway network and minimize impacts on the surrounding area. So this is the proposed redevelopment concept plan that you are making a recommendation on this evening. Here you have Fleur Daniel Drive and Creek Bend Drive that surrounds the campus, Lake Point Parkway being over here, and then you've got 59 to the kind of to the south and 6 on the other side there. So they are proposing to have about 10 to 15 acres of multifamily and or townhome, urban home, live work mixed zone. So that's this area in the orange. They are anticipating up to 720 multifamily units, which is consistent with what is in the land use plan. And the other part of the development in the yellow, you have the townhome, urban home, live work area, which is about 25 to 30 acres. And then in response to some of the inquiries and requests from the workshop, they did add an optional commercial development zone, which is shown here in the kind of red hatching. And then finally, you have the civic and recreational zone, which is really a key part of their development, where they are preserving the trees and going to be adding some new trails and amenities and things like that. And so that will be at least 5 acres, probably in the kind of 8 to 10 acre range, depending on exactly how the roadways get carved out and things like that. So as a reminder, we did have a workshop with the Commission and Council on the 22nd of April, and there was some discussion about the proposed development being only residential. The developer did indicate at that time that there really isn't a market for commercial at this time, but they are planning for potential pop-ups, temporary commercial uses within the civic green space. There were also some questions related to parking for events in the civic space, price point of homes, and consistency with the land use plan. The following evening on April 23rd, there was a community meeting at the Hyatt Place where we had almost 100 residents in attendance. The comments that night focused largely on traffic, housing types and price point, ownership and programming of the civic space, impact to schools, and construction impacts. And then finally, we had a joint public hearing last week with the City Council and Planning and Zoning Commission, where staff and developer presented the concept. We had 4 members of the public that spoke during that hearing. 1 was in favor of the project, 2 mentioned concerns for the lack of non-residential, and then 1 expressed concerns about the number of multifamily and the lack of 1-story options for seniors. Ultimately, the council and commission discussion also focused on acknowledging the changes that have been made in response to the previous comments. There was also one question about traffic and one question about the property values that are expected to be generated from the development. So with all of that, staff does support a recommendation of approval to the City Council for the Lake Point Green redevelopment concept plan. We do anticipate bringing this to City Council tomorrow evening for their consideration. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Questions for staff? Mary? Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't see anyone say yes. So, Mary.
Thanks, Ruth. Real quick, so I sort of drove the area and, noticed, where all the parking's at, and it had like huge drains in it. But now we're going to be putting houses on top of all that. So has it been thought that do we need any kind of water retention for that small area? Or is it saying, because we're going to have to be able to handle all of that runoff somewhere? Yeah, so we've discussed that with our engineering department, and because there is so much pervious coverage where the water cannot run through in the parking lots today, we're actually expecting that there may be even a decrease in the amount of cover that where the water cannot sink into the ground, because you'll have small backyards, and then you have all of that green space that is being maintained. But there is not any detention that is needed as long as they are not increasing the coverage from what it is today. Okay. And the other question I had is the creek that goes around Lake Point, is it also controlled in the same way that Oyster Creek is?
I believe that is part of Oyster Creek. Yeah.
Well, there's that little loop, it says it's a different, it's
all part of the same waterway, though.
So it'll still be controlled by that for flooding as well?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
And then the other question I had is from a foundation standpoint, I would assume that the water table is probably relatively high in that space. And what happens if they get into this and they need special foundations so they don't have any kind of issues with houses sort of shifting or sinking once they've built all of these houses and apartments on this sort of plot?
Those are questions I am not able to answer, but I also don't think that they're necessarily pertinent to the concept plan.
Correct. But I just wonder who's going to be responsible for ensuring that sort of looked at least, to make sure that the right kind of footings go in.
We do have a building code that addresses foundations, and so I'm sure that those are things that are looked at through the building permit process.
So it'll be through the inspectors
and the inspection process. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Thank you. That's all I have.
Maybe.
Not really questions, maybe one question, but one general comment and maybe a question in there. But wanted to thank the applicant for being willing and transparent throughout the whole process and listening to our feedback and being receptive. I don't know that it's required, but I was just curious on what their plans were as we progress forward. I would just encourage them to continue to keep that dialogue with the residents in the community, given how many residents showed up to the initial meeting and how much interest there was at our workshop in the first meeting. So I don't know that it's required. I don't think we can require it, but encourage them to continue to have those dialogues, because I know transparency and just this is such a big project and such a very, spotlight on it, just making sure that we keep the residents and the community engaged as much as possible throughout the process.
Okay.
And to that point, I guess, from a general process perspective, once it goes through our commission and goes to city council, can you highlight just the big picture process on what follows from there?
Sure,
in terms of the development?
So the next step would be platting. So you as a commission will see a preliminary plat for a section of the development. They could come and do a preliminary plat for the whole thing, but it'll probably be for a small piece of the development, and then final plat. And on the staff side, we'll be looking at the infrastructure construction plans to make sure that the streets and water and wastewater and all of that is developed in compliance with city standards. And all of that would be taking place in advance of any buildings being constructed. I would expect that they would be starting with residential. Well, it's all going to be residential, probably one of the single family sites, I think, from what I understand. But that's kind of the general process.
And one last follow-up, just something I thought of. Since traffic came up, I think, in our meetings and with the residents, when do those analysis get shared with us? And what part of the process does that materialize and surface?
So the traffic study would probably take place before the first plat. I would not necessarily expect that it would be something that would be considered by the commission. I mean, we could mention it, when it does get platted, but what that's really going to tell us is, are there additional turn lanes that are needed? Does the road need to be narrower or wider in certain places? And so it's largely probably going to be impacted Creek Bend Drive, I think, and that's already a dedicated right-of-way. And so there's nothing there for the commission to review or, approve for that to take place. So that would be done at the staff level.
That's all
Any other questions?
Motion to approve?
Let me call the question. We've got a motion for a recommendation of approval for the proposed redevelopment concept plan for Lake Point Green to members of City Council by Commissioner Brown. We've got a second by Commissioner DeWood. Any other questions? All right, we're hand voting. We're not electronic. So all in favor? And all opposed?
Okay.
You can count. All right, that motion passes. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you.
And we have nothing else on our agenda for tonight.
That is on.
I'll entertain a motion to adjourn. I've got a motion to adjourn and a second hand vote. That passes. We are adjourned. Good night,
Thank you very
everyone.
much.
Or good afternoon.